The next step I want to take is to explain how you can take all of these ideas and turn them into a research project where you can go out there and gather evidence regarding how the theories and ideas that you've been talking about work in real life, work right in front of your eyes. And to do that, I want to talk about a project that I did where I went to observe a particular media event, which was not the fight itself, not the Ronda Rousey Holly Holm fight itself, but actually the press conference that was held at Etihad Stadium just before the fight, a few months before the fight, as part of the marketing campaign. And I'll explain why I wanted to have a look at that. But one of the things that I wanted to do was I was more interested in not so much what happened in the fight. To me, that wasn't important. What I was interested in was how the fight was marketed and how the fight was promoted as something that was important to not only the UFC but to culture generally. Why this was an important cultural event that was happening in Melbourne for a particular reason. And the place to find those explanations and those arguments wasn't, I argued, in the fight itself, but in the promotion of the fight. And there was a particularly interesting event that happened. I'll just click forward here just quickly before coming back. Which was a press conference that happened a few months before the fight. And I argued that this was actually the place where you could see the media sport cultural complex in action. And the method I chose was simply to go along to the press conference and watch what happened there. Now, what I was doing there was using a method which is quite common in research on media tourism called participant observation. And this is covered in a very well by a book by a person called John Van Manen, which talks about going into particular places, treating them as cultures, and kind of watching what goes on in particular places and trying to figure out the rules that happen, the rules that structure places, try and examine how people create meaning under given conditions. And one of the methods that Van Manen champions is as I say, is participant observation, which involves looking at people interact in particular ways, in particular settings, and trying to figure out what the rules of those places are. So it's a way of giving meaning to places and the actions that take place within those places. And Van Manen's concept is if you look at what people do in particular places, you can see that what they do reflects their understanding of the meaning of that place. And if we were going to talk about applying this to the participant observation of this particular press conference, which again is kind of looking at the question of how marketing creates meaning around a particular event, there are a few things that we could talk about that need to be considered here. So, firstly, this was taking place at what was then called the Etihad Stadium, which is now called the Marvel Stadium. So, the first thing we would need to ask is, well, what does it mean that this event was taking place in this particular stadium? And if we look at the history of Etihad, now Marvel Stadium, we find that it has a particular history that gives it a particular meaning in Melbourne. So the Etihad Stadium, now the Marvel Stadium, is a really important landmark in Melbourne's cultural economy, and that needs to be taken into account whenever we're thinking about things that happen in it. So one of the things that Marvel Stadium, then Etihad Stadium, was significant for was a significant node of a reorganised Melbourne, of a Melbourne that whose cultural economy is significantly related to a particular sport, the AFL, Australian Rules Football. And the way that the combination of the AFL and having a new setting for the AFL was really a fairly deliberate attempt to use the AFL to market Melbourne as a global centre for sporting excellence. So if we, and you're able to figure this out, one of the things I did is I went off and I researched the history of that stadium and found that it was a pretty explicit design that was designed to modernize Melbourne's existence as a global sports centre. So it's no accident then that the UFC comes there, because Melbourne has been trying to attract global franchises, sporting franchises, to the city for quite some time. And the other thing is that the UFC, one could argue, the next thing you would need to do is research the UFC as a significant global media business. One of the things that's notable about the UFC is it really is a unique sport, because it's something that imagines itself as a leisure business first and foremost. So the UFC is not just fights, it is pay-per-view events. It is reality television. It is a chain of its own gyms. It's connected to the leisure economy. It's significant that the UFC came to Australia just as it was investigating the possibility of launching its gyms in Melbourne. And if you know anything about martial arts in Melbourne, you know that it's a very competitive setting. There are all kinds of martial arts gyms that are jostling for attention in Melbourne's economy. And the UFC was attracted to Melbourne partly because of Melbourne's experience in staging global media events, but also because it wanted to launch its brand on Australian shores. So again, there's no accident that this fight ended up happening in Melbourne, because you have a set of mutual commercial interests that need to be dramatized. And that dramatization was seen not in the fight. The fight itself lasted less than 2 minutes. But it was to be found in the press conference. And the press conference that I went along to featured a number of questions from local journalists and the audience about women's sport, about how is it that Ronda Rousey had become the most famous female athlete in the world, despite the fact that she was relatively inexperienced. It's kind of interesting, in that year, she beat Serena Williams for ESPN's Female Athlete of the Year, despite the fact that at that point she'd only had 10 MMA fights, although she was an Olympic bronze medalist, but she had nowhere near the kinds of professional achievements that Serena Williams had. So this raised real questions about and was really insightful in terms of what does it take to be an elite athlete, and the way in which Ronda Rousey's explicit kind of engagement with the worlds of celebrity had promoted her to a level of public interest that one would say was not merited on her athletic performances alone. And the interesting thing about this is that if we looked at this at the press conference, there were a number of interesting places where, whereas in a lot of parts of society, gender is this kind of unspoken kind of reality, in this press conference itself, people were taking it on directly and were talking about why is it that women athletes generally aren't paid as much as male athletes, and so on and so forth. And so the whole thing quite clearly became a a gendered performance and a story about gendered drama. And you could see that in the press conference, in the sorts of questions that were being asked, and then the way that the audience were reacting to those questions, and the way that the athletes were answering the questions as well. If you're interested in that, more is contained in my book. There's further details of that in my book, Exploring Media Research, which is available in the library. But again, the important thing is to focus on, if you're going to do some kind of participant observation, provide a really detailed explanation for why you are observing that particular kind of behavior in that particular place, and why the behaviors and the places are particularly meaningful. That's the trick that you need to manage.